Hello, I'm sat here with Andy Brogan from Easier Inc. and we've just had a fantastic day looking at the governance for wellbeing teams. So I've asked Andy to go through his presentation again so that we can share it with people, and it also links to a film that we've just done where we're explaining the process. So welcome, Andy.
Thanks, Helen. So shall I share a few words to start us
That
off
would be
from
great,
the
yes.
presentation? So you can see here a picture of me and my beautiful family. So it's my daughter Sophie, my son Finn, my wife Helen. I guess the reason for sharing this morning was just so people knew who they were talking to. Just a little bit about Easier Inc. though. So Easier Inc. I set up with my business partner Dave a couple of years back now. We've worked together as consultants for not far off 10 years, and our sense in creating Easier Inc. was that many organisations that we've worked with, when you talk to people in the organisation, they tell you that it's really hard for their customers to get what they need from the organisation. There are barriers and there are points of friction in the way all the time, and even though we want to work to make it easier, we haven't got there yet. So easier for customers is one reason behind the name. It's also though about making life easier for those who are working to help customers. So I've seen organisations where people just simply don't have the tools they need to do the job, where the work is complex, or sometimes there's simply not enough capacity to do it. There's a whole range of reasons, but we've probably lived through this as customers as well, where we experience the kind of computer says no version of the world. So that's another reason. And the last reason around Easier Inc. is also making it easier to solve those sorts of problems. So this is the main reason why we called it Easier Inc. was our experience has been people get that making it easier to do good work for customers and for customers to get good things from us makes total sense, but they find it very difficult to solve the problems that get in the way. And part of that is because organisations very often have been set up in ways that leave people competing rather than collaborating. So part of our philosophy at Easier Inc. is how can we help people create the sorts of organisations where solving problems is easier.
Brilliant. And we met each other because of your work with HERE, and we must say that they won Social Enterprise of the Year this year. We're very proud of them for achieving this, and thank you to Mark particularly for introducing us, and Zoe. So we've been building on some of the thinking that you've done with colleagues in HERE and exploring what it means for us. And this was the purpose that we looked at today. So would you explain a bit about this?
Yeah. So I had the great pleasure, as you know, Helen, of working with you to develop a version 1 of what the governance structure for wellbeing teams could look like. Our purpose today was to share that version 1, but to share it in the spirit of helping people really get their head around how it applies to their work. We wanted to make it something practical for them, not something abstract. And we wanted to make it practical in a way that allowed them to take ownership of it and to see that it was not just an opportunity but a responsibility for them to take it and to iterate on it so that it stayed fit for purpose, or so that it became fit for purpose. So we understood at the outset that all frameworks are flawed to some degree. So I think today we had a really good time, and I think the team have left with the ownership that will allow them to change it and keep it fit for purpose.
Absolutely. We did a closing round, and you'll remember Michelle saying that she thought that from the session today she could do something differently tomorrow, and that's always been one of our criteria of a good day is can we put it into practical, useful actions the next day. So that was brilliant. I love the way you described this morning, and it particularly resonates with me because I know that when I become anxious, because I'm worried that I don't have the information that I need, my tendency is to dysfunctionally micromanage people, and I cannot do that within wellbeing teams. It'd be a disaster to do that, particularly as we're working to self-management. So please explain this as you did this morning.
So this is a framework that I personally find really useful and was taught to me by a consultant in mental health services. So what this consultant said to me was, unless someone has an organically based mental health condition, that what they see time and time again is sitting behind the behaviour that we might describe as dysfunctional. that essentially is leading that individual to cause them self-harm or not enjoy their life, there's always anxiety. And sitting behind that anxiety, there's always a felt loss or lack of control. And those words feel important to me. So the first thing is the person may have control, but if they feel that they don't have control, then there will be heightened anxiety. And in the context of that heightened anxiety, they're going to pay attention to things in ways that are dysfunctional. And I know that in my own behaviour. I think this is something we probably all recognise. The other element around the choice of words here is loss or lack of control. So I may lose control. I may have had control and now I'm feeling like I'm losing it. And actually my experience of this is when I feel like I lose control that I've had, my anxiety is that much greater. I'm that much more dysfunctional. So losing control can be worse than never having it at all. And the way this plays out in organisations, I think, and this is why I personally find it useful, is that we see, I think, over the span of history that organisations have understood that what we need is we need to put more control, more decision making closer to our customers. So in health and social care, we even talk about giving customers control themselves. We don't call them customers, of course, it's patients and citizens and people. But we get this idea that to perform really well, we need to push decision making closer to the front. But as we do that, one of the things that can happen is that while control nearer the front increases and a sense of control nearer the front increases, those who previously had control, where decisions were taken in hierarchy, feel like they're losing something. So for them, there can then be this heightening of anxiety, and that can create dysfunctional behaviour in them where they feel that they need to check up, they feel like they need more assurance, they may impose an additional reporting burden, or they may actually ironically increase the number of protocols, procedures, specifications people are working to. And so you kind of see, I think, this process by which organisations become gummed up over time, where we've been, without meaning to, we've been pushing anxiety up and down hierarchies as we wrestle with this issue of how do we devolve control. So that's why I like the framework. And I guess for me, what I use it for in my own work is as a sense check that we're trying to create this place I call Easier Inc., this place where everyone feels like they have the control they need, everyone feels they have the assurance they need, nobody's walking around feeling anxious and behaving dysfunctionally, but how easy it is to trip into that without meaning to. So I use it as a sense check for how are we making sure that everybody is feeling that sense of control, everybody's having their anxiety managed or catered to, and therefore everybody is given the full opportunity to behave functionally rather than dysfunctionally.
Lovely. I love the way you describe this. So we've often in our work in the past talked about what we're moving from to, and you explained this for us in the context of governance.
Yeah, so this builds on the last, really, that I think in the old world of governance, if you like, or the world that I think many of us are trying to find a better way from, I call it Harder Inc. The default position around governance is to think of it as a checking up or a checking on. So that can look like behaviours that are around specifying what we want to happen and then inspecting for whether it has happened. And that really goes back to the last slide around where does control or felt sense of control sit. And I think when we're handed specifications and then inspected on whether we delivered them, we feel a very weak sense of control or no control at all. And the act of inspection actually can even heighten our dysfunction because it creates greater anxiety for us. It's not just that I don't have control over what I'm doing. I'm now being held accountable for whether I did it and whether it worked. And that almost even feels unfair if we're not careful. So in those environments, we can get dysfunction through that. But also they can create a compliance culture, really a compliance focus where our attention starts to form around whether we're doing the thing we've been asked to do and not whether the thing we've been asked to do is achieving its purpose. So it's a real missed opportunity in terms of learning. And building on that, it tends to create cultures where we're kind of static, we're locked into calcified processes. It's constraining. It's very hard for us to change, because actually to get something changed, we need to go back through the decision-making hierarchy to get a new specification. I don't have the ability, without that decision-making myself, to just adapt and flex around customer need or around my context. And lastly, on that side of this slide, we've got the defensive practice that can create. So if I don't have control over what to do, when to do it, how to do it, that sort of stuff, but I know I'm going to be held to account, I can find myself in behaviours where I do things not because they're useful, but because they protect me from being held to account in ways that feel unfair to me. So we've seen examples of this, I'm sure, in all of our own work, where we copy everybody into our email because we just want to be sure. Or we write absolutely everything down because we just want to be sure. And so defensive practice isn't just an unnecessary thing, it's actually an economically inefficient thing for us to do. And it's another distraction from our true purpose, where we start behaving towards risk in ways that are unhelpful.
So what's the alternative?
So if that's harder ink, easier ink, I think, stacks up against that in a reasonably neat way. So instead of checking up or checking on, it's checking in. So how do we have the conversations that really matter, but in a way that isn't about exercising power over each other? It's about exercising power with. So we're talking about what's going on and how we can do something. Our focus isn't to specify and inspect, it's to understand and enable. And therefore, we're working actively on how do we move from a compliance focus to a responsibility focus, where we may, of course, still be compliant, but as an outcome of being responsible. And therefore, if we do that, we have much greater opportunity to be lithe and adaptive in our work, and therefore for things to evolve rather than be static, to feel liberated rather constrained. And therefore for our default behaviour to be about responsible innovation, not just madcap, wild, throw it at the wall and see what sticks innovation, but responsible innovation based on an understanding of the opportunity we have to make a difference.
But this isn't about good people and bad people, is it?
No, that's right. And for me, it's not even about good organisations or bad organisations or any of that. I don't think in Harder Ink there's any malintent at work. In fact, I think there's right-headed people with right intent. But it's just so easy to fall into the traps of creating this sort of compliance culture and defensive practice that we don't intend. And that's why I find the framework about responsibility, control, anxiety, and so on helpful, because it just keeps us honest. So if we set out to create easier ink, I think we start with an assumption that people would rather do a good job than a bad job, but we need to enable that. And so as leaders, we just need to constantly pay attention to that and help people to do it.
Lovely. So you've introduced the fact that we have been thinking about our own governance structure, and we're starting, as you've put here, with version 1. These are the 3 key elements of it, and we've got another film that goes into it in detail, but please give us an overview of these 3 and why they're so important.
Yeah, so if I try and look through the fog of what makes governance work in my experience, the first bit is left shifting. So what I mean by that is, if we are to imagine at the end of all the work that we might do, on the right-hand side of our process, if you like, we've delivered great stuff. Focusing on all that great stuff could lead us into a world of complexity, where there are so many outcomes that matter that it just feels impossible that we could possibly deliver them all if we manage them all separately. So for me, left shifting is about recognising we don't need to manage every outcome separately, that we need to recognise they're connected because they're the consequence of a shared system of work, a shared way of doing things. So if we can work out what are the few things that we do that make the greatest difference to those outcomes, the few key capabilities our organisation has to have to do great work, and we focus on those, then we can deliver great outcomes as a consequence, not as a focus. So that's left shifting. As we kind of work to do that, reflective practice is really important, that it's not enough for us to just blindly stumble forward and hope, But it's also not enough for us to just look at our data and hope that our data kind of tells us the answer. So we need to be reflective. And my experience around this is reflective practice is something we all know we need to do, but it so often kind of drops off the table as we just don't have time. So for me, good governance is about baking in reflective practice, creating the time and space, but also kind of giving it the structure. So not enough, in my view, to just sit down and have the space, but I need to have the space with some prompts that help me to reflect accurately and reflect on those few things we do that make the greatest difference. And I think if we do that, if we create the habits, norms, routines, the structures around that, it helps people to really own the difference that they can make. So it creates this responsibility culture that I've talked about. Then lastly, meetings. So meetings can be formal or social spaces. Actually, it will typically be both. But good governance for me is about recognising that without those spaces, we can do all the reflective practice in the world. We can, know our few things we need to do that make the greatest difference, but we won't really have the opportunity to co-create meaning around where do we need to act together, folks. I think when you look at most opportunities and issues in organisations, they tend to sit across boundaries. So actually, unless we have the opportunity to come together to co-create meaning, to set shared priorities and shared focus, we find ourselves locked in our silos, unable to act. So a real key function of meetings for me is that opportunity to bring people together to create action across the boundaries and therefore shared priorities and focus.
Thank you. And we've been looking at what this means in practice. And to pick up your point about lots of people think the reflective practice will take a long time or just happen naturally, we've designed a process that we think will simply add 20 minutes into our meeting structure, which is already very lean, and that will be all it will take to do a great job of doing reflection, but most importantly to act on what that means and how we take things forward. So as you said, this is version 1, and we'll see how we get on with that.
So this was just a slide where when we talked about the meeting structures, how do we make the most of the time we have together? And, again, there's common sense at work here, I think, but when we come together for a weekly meeting, which is what this slide talks to, it's useful for us to look backwards. And the purpose of looking backwards is about creating that shared meaning. Do we see the same things when we look at the week that's just passed? When I describe it as a good week, did you experience it as a good week, or did you experience something different? So a chance to share stories about what we've experienced in the week, a chance to share the outcomes of the structured reflections you've just mentioned, Helen, and also a chance to look at our outcome data to say, is that helping us to understand how well we're doing? So that is the backward look. Forward look is, so how do we set ourselves up to have a good week next week? Or a good month, or whatever frame we're putting to it. When we look at that, there's things like scheduling our time, just making sure we've enough people with the right skills around to do the job. But there's also what we've called as an interim title, the worry board. So in the context of wellbeing teams, this would be a board of the people that our wellbeing team looks after and our level of concern for them. But moving away from the title of worry, it's not just about our level of concern, it's also about their level of happiness, of independence, of thriving in their life. So that's why worry board doesn't quite work. But essentially it's a way of visualising how well are people doing that we're looking after, so that we can, at a glance at this board, make some decisions about where do we need to put our capacity next week and how can we make the biggest difference. So that's the forward look. And then the making better easier, or the opportunities to improve component, is about taking the outcomes of the conversations that we have when we look back and when we look forward and saying, where are we seeing the opportunities for us to just make life that bit easier? So it could be making it easier for those we're supporting, making it easier for the people providing the support, or as I said at the top of this, it could be making it easier to solve the problems themselves. So are we identifying places where we're kind of rubbing up against each other rather than working together seamlessly? And as we do that, We're going to spot different types of opportunities, stuff that we can just do that doesn't need a lot of planning, versus stuff that actually we might need to take a bit more time together, or we might need to seek support around. And in our weekly meeting for version 1 of our governance, we're suggesting that the stuff we would seek support on, we wouldn't do in the meeting itself, but we would put into a process where it would go to the wellbeing support team for them to prioritise and act on. So this is version 1, but it provides, I think, a couple of handholds for how do we have a productive meeting.
Thank you. And we've done a separate film where we work through in detail how this will look. And as Andy said, this is version 1. We're committing to trying it for 3 months, coming back together, reviewing it, looking at what we tried, learned, pleased about, concerned about, and how we want to change it, and then moving to version 2. So if you're interested in following what we're learning and trying, we'll be posting films and sharing examples and writing this up as well. And we'd be delighted if you come along and share your views on that too. Thank you very much.